For almost a quarter of a century, the French financier and philanthropist Albert Kahn bankrolled one of the most ambitious projects in photographic history. During a period of rising international tensions, Kahn created the Archives of the Planet, a storehouse of images that would encourage greater understanding and respect for the diverse cultures of the world. Kahn dispatched a team of photographers to more than 50 countries, where they captured many extraordinary images of the lives of ordinary people. They encountered fishermen braving the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic, and in the Islamic world, women emerging from behind the veil. They produced the first ever recordings of voodoo ceremonies in a French colony in West Africa, and some of the earliest colored documentary films preserving the vibrant cultural life of France itself. These compelling images give us a unique insight into the wonderful world of Albert Kahn. In 1922, a ship left the French port of Le Havre to journey 3,000 miles across the North Atlantic. On board was a cameraman who had been sent by Albert Kahn on a unique and dangerous mission.
There is a fascinating notion in a lot of Kahn's work is to reach places that are really far away, that no one perhaps was able to reach unless there was a very good reason for doing so. And one was Newfoundland, which was a British colony, not part of Canada until 1949, in which there are two industries. One is timber and the other is fishing, and that's it.
The French had occupied parts of Newfoundland since the 16th century. By the 1920s, they only held on to the small island of Saint-Pierre. But they'd retained local fishing rights, and so every year about 7,000 Frenchmen would spend months in these treacherous seas fishing for cod. In 1922, Kahn's cameraman Lucien Le Saint joined the fishermen. He kept a detailed diary of his voyage.
Saturday, May the 6th. 8 o'clock in the evening. The weather is fine now, completely calm. We are totally surrounded by ice. We've seen icebergs 2 or 3 times the size of our boat. It's both a wonderful and frightening sight.
Le Saint wanted to film all aspects of the fishing process, which at this time still included the use of the ancient technology of hook and line.
As far as I'm aware, this is an absolutely unique piece of film. What we can see is really a system that died probably in the 1930s. So we're really on the brink of a disappearing age, as it were. And the way they fished in those times was by using dories. Now, each dory is like a saucer. It can stack one inside the other. It has no deck. Each schooner that came across from France would have perhaps 10 dories and 24 men. And the idea is they're all lowered into the sea, usually with 2 fishermen in each dory, and off they go, spreading out in a star formation or in a spoke formation. And from their dories, the men would then throw out their hand lines. Then they bring the fish back into the mothership where they're pitched back on board.
Lucien Le Saint was the ideal choice for a mission as grueling as this.
Il devait supporter des conditions de temps extrêmement difficiles.
He had to put up with terrible weather. Not only lots of storms, but the cold. It was constantly very cold. There were also problems with food because the food they took on board was very limited. So they just had to eat a lot of fish. His relationship with the men was very good, for the simple reason that my grandfather had sea legs. He was never seasick, not even during storms. And he joined in the fishermen's lives, because he was enduring the same conditions as they were.
Le Saint had established a reputation as an exceptionally intrepid cameraman. He'd covered the First World War, had specialized in aerial photography, and had traveled all over the world.
Lucien Le Saint était sans doute de toute l'équipe des opérateurs d'Albert Kahn.
Lucien Le Saint was without a doubt the most cinematic of Kahn's cameramen. For example, he never took colour autochromes. He was truly a professional film cameraman, both in his training and his taste. And that's clear in his framing, in the technical quality of the images he delivered. He knew all the tricks of the camera and was excellent at his craft. He worked well even in really tough situations, like being out at sea.
Saturday, May the 13th. These men work like slaves. Sometimes they get lost in the fog, dragged off by the currents which take them out of sight of their ship. And every time we see that happening, if the weather is terrible, it's goodbye to those little boats. Thursday, May the 25th. Today, we rescued 2 men who had been lost at sea for 48 hours.
Once they'd brought the cod aboard, the men started preparing the fish by gutting them and storing them in salt water. Many of the fishermen would sleep for just an hour or 2 a day.
This is cold work. A man's hands could freeze in perhaps half an hour or so. But it was difficult to work in the fiddly conditions of either baiting hooks or gutting fish if you're wearing gloves. So generally speaking, as you can see in these pictures, people haven't got protected hands at all. And one can only imagine the damage they did to their hands after a season of fishing in these very difficult conditions.
Joining the fishing fleet was a hospital boat, the only place the men received any sort of medical attention. The doctor would perform operations of every kind, from tooth extractions to amputations.
The conditions were such that the likelihood of disease was extremely strong, but also there were injuries caused perhaps by puncture wounds from fish or from knives, and these would become very infected in the filthy environment of fish gutting. One has to remember there's a lot of gurry and pip, as it's called, lying around. That's the sort of fish mess. And these would infect, and we're still 20 years off antibiotics, and so the only way the doctors could deal with these appalling injuries was to drain them as best they could and hope for the best.
Thursday, May the 25th. We've seen quite a few ships, bringing with them about a dozen sick men, a lot with leg injuries from getting in and out of the dories, but mostly for infected hands. The doctor had to drain 5 infected wounds today, and tomorrow he'll have to cut off a man's thumb. The fishermen stay out here 3 or 4 months without fresh water to wash themselves because the supply is limited. It's a tough life.
The only refuge for the French fishermen was their country's last remaining colonial outpost here, the tiny island of Saint-Pierre. It's still a department of France to this day. It trades in euros and imports food from the mother country. Le Saint's camera observed the lives of the islanders, including a man riding a cart powered by a pair of Newfoundland dogs. Le Saint took a shine to the animals and bought himself a puppy, which he named Doris, after the small boats.
Wednesday, June the 14th. We arrived at Saint-Pierre on the 10th. We've spent 4 days here for ship repairs. I'm taking the opportunity to film some great views of the coastline and the drying of the cod.
While filming off Newfoundland, Le Saint saw the future of the fishing industry. Steam engine trawlers using huge nets. Le Saint's images of the new trawlers show the eclipse of ancient fishing methods by the industrial-scale exploitation of the seas. Throughout his project, Kahn wanted to show how traditional ways of life were being displaced by the forces of modernity, a process all too visible in the images shot during the 1920s in the French colonies of North Africa. By the time Kahn's cameras arrived in Tunisia, its cities already boasted European buildings and transport systems. But traces of the country's Ottoman past remained, glimpsed in traditional forms of dress and its classical Islamic architecture. France profited both from the farm produce of her colonies and by selling them new technologies that revolutionized North African agriculture. Since the 1830s, Algeria had been under French rule. By the 1920s, thousands of French settlers were living on Algerian soil. Many Algerians had lost lands. The Muslim majority were denied democratic rights, and resistance to the French was often brutally suppressed. In neighboring Morocco, which had become a protectorate of France in 1912, new cities were rising. What the French called Ville Nouvelle had been built in Casablanca and Rabat as part of a modernization plan devised by the colonial administrator, the Résident Général, Marshal Lyautey.
Lyautey looked at the model elsewhere. He looked at what the British had done in India and Nigeria and ruled through local leaders. He saw this as a much more efficient way of running things. You didn't have to use so many men. People tended to obey local rulers where it was more difficult with the colonial authorities. It was also quite a bit cheaper, because if you actually keep this idea that the country is still being run by its traditional rulers, you can tax the local people. If you actually take over the fully colonial authority, then you actually have to fund it yourself.
But when Kahn's cameraman Camille Sauvageau toured the country in 1926, he heard voices of dissent. Taking on the role of political street performers, traditional storytellers mocked local rulers who collaborated with the French.
They used to tell stories, but also jokes, and from time to time they ventured to make jokes at the expense of native authorities. I think that these people took part to an important phenomenon, namely shaping collective memory and even shaping national identity, insofar they were telling not only stories but part of history, and not only Moroccan history but Islamic history. And these stories fueled Moroccan patriotism and nationalism.
You're seeing people going about their daily lives in the cities and in the countryside, and that is what makes it very interesting and very valuable. I think this wasn't quite the image the French wanted to be shown of Morocco. It was supposed to be developing it. The French called it the civilizing mission. So to see people still in quite poor conditions was probably not quite what the French administration was terribly keen on.
I was interested in particular by the way people were dressed. The general impression is that people were poor. It has to do with the impoverishment which came as a result of the tax burden. These people had to pay heavy taxes. They had their land confiscated for the benefit of French settlers.
The destitution created by French colonial policies forced many within the rural population to head for the cities. Some Moroccan women were so desperate that they turned to prostitution. These extraordinary images were shot in Casablanca's so-called Special Quarter, which was established by the French for young prostitutes. Most of their clients would be French soldiers. As the colonial power wanted to guard against the spread of venereal diseases, the women were forced to acquire a doctor's certificate to leave the quarter. Prostitution is now illegal in Morocco, and today, sights like this would be completely unimaginable. At the time of Sauvageau's visit, most Moroccans were living in the countryside. In remote mountain villages in the north of the country, he saw Moroccan women engaged in more conventional pursuits than those he'd witnessed in the cities.
There is something interesting also in the pictures, the mixing between men and women. This was something common at that time. Women were present in the fields, doing all sorts of duties, and they had not to veil. Nowadays, under the influence of Islamist movements, women have the veil, and it has nothing to do with Moroccan tradition, if you like. It's something, up to a certain extent, imported.
In the north of the country, Sauvageau encountered Morocco's famous nomadic people, the Berbers. They survived by working in the land, but retained their own culture and tradition. Sauvageau's most poignant images are of a people whose presence in Morocco would soon be greatly diminished. Today, Morocco's Jewish population stands at about 5,000, but at that time there were 20 times that number. There had been a Jewish population in Morocco for more than 2,000 years, and others had emigrated from Spain in the 15th century.
We see on these pictures smiling people, biblical figures. In the 20s, most of the Jews were established in cities, and some of them were living in special or particular parts of the cities named the Mellahs, Jewish quarters. But the Mellahs had nothing to do with the ghettos. They were opened to Muslims, and the Muslims could move easily, and this mixing between the Jews and Muslims in the streets express the coexistence between the two communities.
his images of Morocco, Sauvageot produced a revealing view of life in the colonial world. 2 years later, Kahn gave him another important assignment, one much closer to home. At Albert Kahn's gardens in Boulogne, on the outskirts of Paris, Sauvageot tested out a brand new cinema technology. He was filming moving images, but this time in color. Once again, Albert Kahn was at the cutting edge of technology. A few years before Hollywood perfected Technicolor, his team were already using film stock that reproduced the true colors of nature.
The process in question was called Keller d'Orient-Berton, and it used black and white film. The film was embossed, and because a special lens was used both in the filming and in the projection, the film on screen was in color.
Permet de restituer la couleur.
To Sauvageot, the city of Paris proved to be an irresistible subject for showing off the rich possibilities of color.
Je trouve, d'une part, que ces films sont extrêmement émouvants.
In a way, I find these films very moving, because I've spent years looking at the black and white films in the Kahn collection. And the first time I saw cars in Paris in color, it changed how I saw the past.
Ça a changé ma vision du monde quelque part.
Of course, that's how it was. It was in color, not black and white.
Le rendu de ces films.
The texture of these films is very similar to that of the autochromes. Very similar indeed.
Très très proche.
À l'instar du choc qu'avait provoqué le cinéma.
Just as black and white film at the end of the 19th century had startled people, so colour was something very new. And Albert Kahn took huge delight in showing these films to his privileged guests. One can only imagine their astonishment and pleasure in seeing these images. And even though we're used to seeing the world in colour, these images are still quite magical.
Spécifique, extraordinaire.
Soon, Kahn's team took their camera further afield. They travelled to Cap Martin on the French Riviera, where they filmed students from a local engineering college bathing in the Mediterranean. But his most remarkable colour pictures were shot in the deepest regions of France, the part of the country known as France profonde.
The notion of deep diversity of France as something of an empire in which there are native tribes is something of which Kahn was well aware. He was Alsatian by birth. That entirely different culture, of course, was part of his outlook. So what he chose and what are part of his archive were images of what I might describe as the nomads of the French Republic, groups of individuals who might have been anywhere in the world for all they knew, and to a degree, to show the French exoticism is a way of naturalizing and accepting the exotic all over the world.
In northwestern France, the camera was taken to Le Crenon in Brittany to film the annual pilgrimage to commemorate Saint Ronan, who brought Christianity to the area in the 9th century. Down the coast in the port of Concarneau, Kahn's team observed tuna fishermen bringing in their catch. In the south of France, they filmed the cowboys who roamed the marshes of the Camargue. Since the 19th century, they've ridden the local breed of white horses and raised their cattle here. On the same coast, Kahn's camera recorded a very special occasion, the annual pilgrimage to Sainte Marie de la Mer. It's said that here, Mary, the sister of the Virgin, and Mary, the mother of two apostles, landed on the French coast, along with their black servant girl, Sarah. It's Sarah who's become the focus of the celebration for gypsies, who come here from throughout France, Spain, and Eastern Europe.
I was thrilled to see this footage because there is very little documentary film about gypsies anywhere in Europe at this time. Gypsies are, for a whole series of reasons, suspicious. And immediately you see that the filmmakers have got through that they have transcended the gap between themselves and these people. This ability to present themselves, despite the fact they're extremely poor, with not just with aplomb, but with grace, is quite clear. Even the little shot of the tiny children dancing captures an element of that.
The highlight of this pilgrimage is the Great Procession, when statues of the saints are taken to the sea to be blessed by the local archbishop. Significantly, it's the gypsies who are given the honor of carrying the statues.
For them, of course, this is a moment of grace. It's a moment in which this population that is, in so many ways, outsiders, are the main bearers of a central ritual of the Catholic Church. And in that sense, it's a moment of inclusion. It's a moment in which the gypsies are treated as equals by those they live amongst.
As well as recording the exotic within his own homeland, Albert Kahn also wanted to document cultural traditions practiced in far-off French colonies. A unique opportunity to do this arose when he met the Catholic missionary Père au Pied. In 1930, Kahn sent his photographer Frédéric Gadmer on a remarkable expedition to the West African kingdom of Dahomey. Known today as Benin, Dahomey had been one of the most important links in the transatlantic slave trade. Unlike many missionaries, Père au Pied embraced the culture of Dahomey and maintained close relationships with its people. Born in 1899, Salomon Bioku vividly remembers the impact that Père au Pied made upon them.
He had tremendous character. He had great influence over people. You had to see his face, his stature. He made a huge impression, and he drew people towards him.
In his mission, in the way he approached people, he was totally absorbed by traditional society. And he benefited from having very strong friendships with village chiefs, with the kings even, and everyone who mattered in Dahomey.
Père au Pied's contacts ensured that Gadmer's cameras enjoyed extraordinary access to the royal elite. But by prior arrangement with the church, Gadmer also focused on the missionaries, who wanted a record of their work in Dahomey. At Dahome's main port, Cotonou, he filmed the arrival of more nuns. Ganma's films show the success of the missionaries in converting Africans to Catholicism. Père Aupier himself had helped to popularize the faith by using analogies that associated local people with stories from the Bible. Ganma filmed a potent example of this, the annual dramatization of the Epiphany. It's a ritual that's still performed in Porto Novo today.
He said to himself, just as the kings from the Orient brought their gifts to the baby Jesus, so the kings of Porto Novo could also pay homage. And so, accompanied by music and princesses, the court would come to the cathedral and live out this divine event we call the Epiphany. And the Epiphany has not only become a day of celebration, but a way for the local culture to embrace Christianity.
But from the outset, both Kahn and Aupier also wanted to record the authentic, original culture of Dahomey, including its indigenous religion, Voodoo. In much of the West, Voodoo was considered a pagan mix of superstition and savagery. But Aupier viewed it as a legitimate religion with its own theology and morality. Voodoo maintains there is a single unknowable divinity, but that people can make contact with the divine through a variety of different gods, each of which possesses specific powers and responsibilities. Gadmer filmed initiation rituals in which a priest invokes a divinity by showering young women with water from his mouth. And in this sequence, an initiate who's revived from a catatonic state seems to return from the dead. Voodoo remains an integral part of the life of many people in Benin. The religion spread with the slave trade to the Americas and Haiti, where European colonialists associated it with the practice of witchcraft, black magic, and evil spells. But as Kahn's films showed, to the Africans, Voodoo is a positive, celebratory religion.
Vaudou is indispensable. Vaudou doesn't kill. Vaudou is not witchcraft. Vaudou is a force for good. Vaudou has healing powers. For many, Voodoo contains obvious parallels with some of the doctrines and rituals in Catholicism.
Of course, when people from Dahomey first went into a Catholic church and saw all the statues and different saints, and there's the Virgin Mary, and there's Jesus, and so to them there was a male and female version of the divinity, which is exactly what you get in Voodoo. That it was all incredibly recognisable. And the priests would say to them, don't leave the Catholic Mass and go across the road to a Voodoo ceremony. And they think, why not? It's all an extension of the same thing.
Unlike most of his fellow missionaries, Père Aupier recognized that the observance of rituals and the respect given to those in authority had prepared the Africans very well for conversion to Catholicism. He even tolerated what most of his colleagues considered beyond the pale, the central ritual of animal sacrifice. These were the first ever moving pictures of such ceremonies. This scene in particular would still be difficult to capture today, as it features the Somba people who live in the far north of the country.
The Somba are hunters. They look phenomenally strong. They have initiation rituals and rites of passage for young men where they undergo huge amounts of sensory deprivation and then have to get up and dance for 12 hours. Their dancing is astounding. They will do dances that look like a really hard military workout, and if you did it for 10 minutes you think, well, that'll do me. But actually they'll do it for 12 hours, 14 hours all through the night. What's astounding about the footage to me is it's still really hard to get to where the Somba are. It's very far inland, very, very harsh countryside. The Somba are still very secretive. So that they got this footage, that they got very close to those people, is actually remarkable.
When the expedition was over, Gadmer has shot more than 6 hours of film and over 300 autochromes. Back at Kahn's home on the outskirts of Paris, his attempt to improve French appreciation of African culture would be put to the test. To Kahn's delight, the scientists and academics invited to see the results responded with admiration and praise. But the Catholic Church was not so happy. After a few screenings, the films were suppressed, and Aupier was punished. He was posted to a remote village in the southwest of France.
The great majority of missionaries were profoundly shocked by what they saw in Père Aupier's films. He'd given voodoo its own status as a religion and showed Dahomey to be a truly civilized society. And so his associates protested about him, and you can read it in their letters. They said that what Père Aupier found sacred, other missionaries saw as the work of the devil.
The following year, a group of Dahomey's chiefs and political leaders were invited to Albert Kahn's home outside Paris. They'd travelled to France to attend a spectacular public event. In May 1931, the Colonial Exhibition opened in Paris, and Kahn's cameras were there to record it. This massive world fair reconstructed some of the greatest architectural splendours on Earth.
The French decided they were going to focus on their empire and on other people's empires apart from the British Empire. So they created these enormous, giant stage sets, in effect, villages, palaces as they call them sometimes, and put the peoples of the world on display in Paris. a lot of evidence to show that when people went to these things, they thought they were really seeing the world. They thought they were seeing Chinese and African people in their indigenous environment, and they believed the stories they were being told about them in these exhibitions.
In pictures shot at the exhibition, subjects often return a weary gaze. The artificiality of the event was at odds with the ideals of Kahn's project, which had sought to represent world cultures authentically, in their own contexts and on their own terms.
When Albert Kahn's cameramen went to the countries in question, they tried to film as objectively as possible the everyday life of people, their dress and their environment, without any intention of creating propaganda. But when the cameramen went inside the colonial exhibition, it was different, because they found themselves in something like a film set. The result was some extraordinary images, such as a mosque with advertising on it, for a drink, an alcoholic drink. The contrast was quite funny.
The colonial exhibition was visited by 34 million people. It was a profitable venture at a time of increasing economic problems in France. The Wall Street crash of 1929 had brought depression to the world's largest economy, the United States. The impact of the calamity soon spread to Europe, and it had a dramatic effect on the finances of Albert Kahn.
Very quickly, Albert Kahn was plunged into spiraling debt, which eventually lasted so long he became bankrupt. Because of that, all his goods, his other properties like the villa in Cap Martin, his furniture and his art collection, they were all put up for auction, mainly in 1936.
Albert Kahn's private garden, where he had delighted in entertaining so many eminent visitors, was turned into a public park. But at least Kahn was allowed to continue living in his home and could walk in the gardens before the crowds arrived.
He would walk amongst the trees, which reminded him of the forest of Vosges from his childhood. And we have a very moving sketch of Albert Kahn, which was made just before his death. He led a simple life, and he still had hopes for the future. When he exchanged a few words with the people who looked after the property, Albert Kahn was always optimistic, and his belief in mankind never left him.
In July 1940, that optimism was severely tested when the German army arrived in Paris. Albert Kahn had come to this city after Germany invaded France in 1870. Now, 70 years later, the Germans were in his homeland once again. Kahn escaped the fate that befell more than 70,000 French Jews in the Nazi deportations that followed the invasion. On the 14th of November 1940, Albert Kahn died in his bed, aged 80. When German soldiers visited Kahn's home, they took away some documents looking for information about wealthy Jews. But his precious collection of films and autochromes was left untouched.
It's rather fortunate that these images didn't awaken any interest on the part of the occupying forces, Because if you think about it, their intent is the exact opposite of Nazi ideals.
Exacte antithèse des thèses nazies.
Imagine treating all these cultures with equal respect. These images were preserved, and today they speak to us even more forcefully and directly, unlike Nazi propaganda.
For many years after the war, Kahn's collection lay dormant. Few knew what treasures were hidden in the cans of film. The glass autochromes remained in their boxes, considered too fragile and difficult to view. But in the 1970s, the newly formed local government established a museum dedicated to Kahn's collection. At last, the autochromes were systematically catalogued and preserved.
It's like a sleeping beauty that has literally come awake after many, many decades. And I think that in many ways, its time has come. We now really do appreciate and understand that photography is the historical source of the 20th century.
The film collection, which could have deteriorated and gone up in flames, has now been conserved and safely restored. Digital technology is giving a new lease of life to these images from another age.
This archive is the hidden riches of the first era of globalization. Kahn means something now because we're all globalized. Those people who lived different lives through different languages, different dress, different religious and ritual forms, they're going to be homogenized into people just like us. And what a loss that will be.
Once Kahn's house and gardens were visited by Europe's political and cultural elite. Today his home is a public space in which regular exhibitions reveal the treasures of his archives of the planet.
Albert Kahn is dead. His ideals continue in other forms and organizations, but the aim of the museum is to make people understand how this man realized his ideals, which have a universal and timeless value. And thanks to these images, which speak to us so clearly, we are straight away connected to our past. The real value of the archives of the planet is the capacity to connect our shared past with people today, and, of course, to future generations.
Albert Kahn believed it was possible to use photography to improve the world by fostering international understanding of cultural differences. His project amassed around 100 hours of cine footage, a collection that's been described as one of the world's most important archives of early non-fiction films. But there's also his extraordinary portfolio of 72,000 autochromes, a treasury that includes the first ever colour pictures of many countries, colour photographs of seminal moments in 20th century history, and very rare colour images of some of the most eminent people of the age. Kahn's photographers were to witness events that shaped our modern world. Yet it's their intimate portrayal of everyday life that provides the most potent and memorable images in this extraordinary archive. People at work and at play, in sickness and in health, moments of triumph and despair, times of quiet reflection and exuberant display. By using the infant medium of colour photography, Kahn assembled a collection that offers a unique insight into what we usually consider to be a monochrome age. In the process, Albert Kahn created what's almost certainly the most important collection of early colour photographs in the world.